Rob is currently Non-Executive Director for Air Canada, Non-Executive Director for Michael Hill International, Executive Chairman for Zalm Therapeutics, Strategic Advisor to Craggy Range Wines, and Director for Fitout Solutions. Most recently, Rob has worked with the New Zealand Government to help shape the COVID-19 response through liaison with the private sector and now advises the Prime Minister on the Economic Recovery Plan.
Good morning, Rob. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the first leadership series that we've hosted at Hobson Leavy, and we're delighted to have you as part of that. What a crazy 18 months we've had in the world. Back on March the 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic as a consequence of the coronavirus, something that we never ever expected. So I guess as a leader in our country, I wanted to explore with you today what you saw as the biggest challenges through that period.
Yeah, well, I think back to that time, actually I was in India in February, and what was a surprise to me travelling through India at that time is they were already getting people to fill out forms, they were doing temperature checks and so on, and I'd left New Zealand a week or so earlier, and it was like everything felt quite normal actually. So I was starting to get exposed to the concerns that other countries were having. When I arrived back in New Zealand, it kind of blew me away at that time how we were talking about the issue, but we weren't really taking any action. We're still letting tourists arrive into the country, and from these areas that were already having many COVID cases. It was making me quite nervous. So when the country ultimately went into lockdown, and I'd been seconded down to Wellington by that stage, all happened very quickly to work with the government and act as a liaison with business. The first thing that became very apparent to me is, despite the fact that as businesses we all have business continuity plans and crisis management plans and so on, no one had ever thought about an event quite like this. We had thought about SARS and bird flu and swine flu and all these things, but they tended to be relatively short events. If you think of a volcano or an earthquake, the event happens and then you're immediately in a recovery action.
Yes.
It became apparent very early this event, the duration of the event was actually going to be quite extended, and that meant people really had to throw out their business continuity plans and start thinking all over again.
Big long tail.
It was, a long tail. So the event itself was a long duration event. The other aspect was really hard. There was just so little we actually knew. So, because everyone likes certainty, it allows you to plan and so on, but no one knew the answers. So everyone was guessing, and we were all looking to the government for leadership, and the government was having to make decisions in a complete void of the normal information that they have access to, and then they're having to make decisions really fast. And governments, they're not designed to move fast. It's not really their function. They create laws, they create legislation, they go through numerous select committees and reviews to make sure everyone understands the consequences of those decisions. They had none of that time. So all the processes of government all of a sudden became kind of not designed for this purpose that they now had to be applied against. So government stopped functioning as normal. Businesses were kind of not prepared for what was happening. So the first 2 or 3 weeks of lockdown was a really, really difficult period. Everyone was highly agitated.
Yes.
People were anxious. People didn't know really how to engage, where to engage. We all have this natural desire to want to contribute. I was getting bombarded with calls, like hundreds of calls a day, and actually thousands of emails of people saying, I want to help, what can I do? Because we actually didn't know how to harness all that energy, because we kind of hadn't really defined the problem, so we didn't know how we could solve against the problem. So it was pretty
crazy.
chaotic in that first period. Highly anxious, that we were seeing sites, particularly from Italy at that stage. Northern Italy was probably the worst affected part of the world, and hospitals were overflowing and people couldn't get access to the right treatment. the impact on health workers was severe.
Yep.
They're getting far more exposed to the virus than everyday citizens. So I think in Italy, at that point, they assessed the likelihood of a general member of the public, like you and I, dying from coronavirus was something like 1 in 40,000. But if you worked in the health system, the risk of dying was 1 in 900.
Gosh.
So, that insight was feeding back and creating a lot of anxiety in the health service here. Our PPE wasn't up to scratch, and so it was. I felt really anxious, and I felt very uncertain about the future. And I was isolated from my family for that. The first 8 or 9 weeks. So all of that adds tension and anxiety and stress into your world as well. It was scary.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think were the biggest learnings through that on reflection now?
Yeah, well, for me, I look at what we learned through that is you have to start to accept that you have to plan with a lot more uncertainty, and you have to plan with many, many assumptions, and that requires you to do a lot of scenario planning, and we talk about that. But the borders, even today, right? You say, are the borders going to be open in some form by the end of the year? Maybe. If you asked me that question 6 months ago, I would have said by the end of 2021, sure, I would expect the borders to be open. Now I'm not so sure.
That's interesting.
If you ask me kind of when do I think, life will be back to normal, 6 months ago I would have said, well, in a year or two, life should be back to normal. I was having a conversation with Helen Clark recently, who's chairing this independent review of the whole global response to COVID. And she's saying she doesn't expect life to be back to normal as we previously knew it in her lifetime. So
wow.
That's the range of scenarios
That's
that
enormous.
we have to consider, right? And so for businesses, I talk to a number of businesses and they say, well, there's no point in planning because I don't know any of the answers to enable me to plan. I talk to other businesses, they say this is a time where I need to be doing more planning than ever to make sure I know how I'm going to respond under a range of different scenarios. I certainly have empathy with that second point of view. We should be planning a lot now. We should understand if the border does open at the end of the year, how do we respond?
Yeah.
If the border's still closed in 2 or 3 years, what does that mean for my business? If we get a new variant that is able to get around the current vaccine regime, and that means we have to close our borders completely up again until the vaccines evolve to respond to that variant, how will my business respond to that situation? So we need to be doing this scenario planning. We need to be very agile. We need to be able to respond to any new information we get and understand what the impact on our business is. And I guess that one of the hardest things is we need to be prepared to accept that what we believed as the truth a week ago may no longer be the truth.
Yes.
We often hold on to our beliefs too long, and in this world it's very dynamic and new information is coming to hand all the time.
I think one of the biggest learnings has been, if I consider how New Zealand has responded, and I have to say that we've been very fortunate with quite exceptional leadership. They've really listened to the scientists. And I think that's quite an interesting point when you look at the other global responses from leaders. There's been a compromise, but unfortunately, a virus knows no compromise. And it's been quite interesting. I'll be very interested to see how that report comes out, because there's various degrees, but it's almost like we went hard and fast, and we were really vigilant about that. The communication was very clear, and there was no halfway house. Like perhaps in the UK, you had a curfew from 6 o'clock at night, or you could still have a meal in a restaurant as long as you were a certain distance. Yeah. But really, was that going to suffice? And I'd be interested to see, but in New Zealand we didn't allow that. We were pretty rigid, and actually that has been very, very good for us.
Yeah, it's very hard to dissect in retrospect the cause and effect of what were the most important decisions, because again we were making a lot of those decisions without in a void of really knowing
information
and actually enough about the virus and how it worked and how it operated. And so I'm spending a lot of my time now working with the government, looking at how we improve what we're doing and with a focus to the future. And I don't spend a lot of time retrospectively saying, well, should we have made that decision? It actually doesn't matter.
No.
And in reality, you take the wage subsidy, really interesting thing. Like our unemployment levels are nowhere near as bad as what they were predicted. Yeah. Now, is that just because the predictions were wrong? Is that because the wage subsidies worked highly effectively of keeping people in employment through that time when businesses, faced with all that uncertainty, could have easily made decisions to say, look, I'm just going to cut some of my staff costs to conserve my cash because I don't know what's around the corner. So it's hard to unpick, and I see media comment now saying, we paid out too much in wage subsidy. Well, actually, if the benefit of that was we've now got a lot less unemployment, and that's costing the economy a lot less in unemployment benefits and so on, then the payback on that wage subsidy, we're already getting a return on that, right? So
absolutely.
So I'm sure there's some people that have abused it around the edges, but I think that was masterful that we moved so quickly to implement that.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think as a small business owner, I can remember the day that they announced that, and then literally a few days later, it was in our bank account.
Yeah.
And for us, employing less than 15 people, we wanted to keep them in work. We were trying very, very hard just to sort of trickle the work through and just keep going. But it really gave us a sense of confidence that the government was there, we could keep our staff engaged, and I think it also just helped to lower the stress levels enormously. So as a small business owner, I was enormously grateful for that. And actually quite shocked at how effective it was, that it literally was in the bank account within a couple of days, which demonstrates that the government can move quickly when it needs to. So I'm not quite sure who was behind all of that, but I think they did a very, very good job.
Yeah, I agree. And ultimately, the money that has been pumped into the economy has served a really good purpose, right? The economy is relatively buoyant. The majority of businesses I talk to have had a really, really good year. Sadly, that's not true for everyone, but it would definitely be true for the majority. And that's bought us time to build the plan for how we function as an economy and as a society for the next phase. I think the cautionary comment from me is our success in the first 12, 15 months is no guarantee of our success in the next phase of learning to live with this virus.
Yes.
And I think we still have a lot of work to do to navigate through this next phase. It's interesting, if I look at the last 7 to 10 days, both the World Health Organization and Dr. Fauci from the CDC in the US have both come out and said they believe we're moving into the highest risk phase of the whole pandemic today.
Isn't that interesting that you should say that? I wondered that, because it's almost like the guard comes down and we think we've got the vaccine, and so the world's trying to get back to normal. That I can really appreciate those comments.
There's an interesting article from the Seychelles I saw on earlier this week that indicated they've got 60% of their population vaccinated. They move very, very quickly, and they're now they've got a massive wave of COVID is infecting them again. So and admittedly, I think that they've got the Chinese vaccine, so maybe it's not as effective, but it's exactly as you describe it. They're very dependent on tourism. They want to get everyone vaccinated, then open up to tourism again. They've done that, and now they've got this wave rolling through. There's a lot of Americans have only had their first vaccine. They're already heading off to Mexico and the Caribbean for holidays and so on. and they're very nervous in the US that that they can't get people to turn up for their second vaccine.
Yes, well, compliance with that. And I guess also, interestingly, I think there's anxiety around the vaccine as well. And so, I'm surprised at the level of caution and concern about it, but even highly intelligent individuals are extremely nervous about having a vaccine. And so there's significant momentum in that anti-vax phase or space, and I just wonder how we manage through that as well to ensure that people have confidence that it is the right thing to do.
It is, from all the information that I see, the vaccine is absolutely the foundation stone to moving forward as a nation. And for us to have any hope of opening our borders to relatively free movement across our borders, then we need everyone in New Zealand that's eligible to be vaccinated. If we can't get to that level of herd immunity or close to it within our domestic population, then the willingness of the government, and I suspect a lot of the citizens, to allow people to come across our borders from other parts of the world, I think will be very, very limited.
It was interesting, actually. I was speaking to a New Zealand citizen that spent 30 years in Sweden just last night, and they're wanting to come back to New Zealand. And I said, how's it been in Sweden? Because, of course, they had the epidemiologist who was very much about the fact that, I think his name was Menkel, let's be open about all of this, let's have a herd immunity, let's allow everybody to get the disease. She said it has been absolutely terrible. So it's interesting, although he was an expert, he was quite diametrically opposed to our epidemiologist, thank goodness. But, at the time, there was a lot of debate as to what was right and what was the right path to go down. So I suppose it's pretty sobering, really, isn't it? But I wanted to sort of talk to you about what you see as the biggest opportunities that maybe have come out of this crisis, and in particular learnings for organisations. I think there's no question about the fact that we're going to have a lot more flexibility with respect to work, but also around mental health and culture and how we retain those things in our organisations. Where are the opportunities and what are the sort of ways that we can learn from all of this?
Yeah, I'm involved in a number of global businesses. I sit on international boards. I'm an optimist from a New Zealand perspective. I think as a nation of predominantly small businesses, we are agile, we are innovative, we're used to operating from a very remote corner of the world, and I think we've been clever in determining how to access markets and compete in remote markets. So from that regard, I think as a country and as businesses within a country, we will adapt as quickly as anyone can adapt. One business I'm involved in, we've been doing a licensing deal for some really, really cool technology, and we've negotiated this licensing deal, and it's a piece of physical technology with a company in Europe, and done the whole deal remotely. Been sending components up there for them to test and so on, and everything's been video conferencing, and so it is possible. I mean, I wouldn't call it ideal, but it's possible. So I think New Zealand will adapt. It's been clear that the pandemic has put an increased focus on sustainability. It's put an increased focus on health and well-being. It's put an increased focus on carbon footprint. And again, I think New Zealand is a agriculture-based economy, as a country that has a reputation for caring about our environment, for having a relatively clean environment. Whether that reputation is deserved or not, that's a foundation for us to build from. So I think with an abundance of renewable energy sources, with a government that is definitely focused on climate and climate change and sustainability, I think it plays to our relative and comparative strengths as a nation. So, as I say, I'm definitely optimistic. I think it's going to take quite some time for, as I say, things to return to anything akin to normal. I mean, one of my boards is Air Canada. You know, we're not assuming we'll get to pre-COVID levels of air travel for at least another 5 years, and arguably even that is optimistic. So people are going to have to think of different ways to do business. Business trips are going to become a lot more complex than what they've been traditionally because of all the added layers of health process that are going to sit on top of those trips. But as I say, you know, New Zealanders are a very resilient force. I think we're very lucky to have had very stable government here in New Zealand.
Absolutely.
You know, I look in the last couple of decades, and I think we've had 3 outstanding prime ministers in a row leading this country, and there's very few countries that have had a succession of really strong leadership like we have had. Whatever your
political
preferences
persuasion
are
yes.
and so on. I mean, you can't help but admire what each has achieved in their own ways. So I think as a consequence of that, our politics is very centrist. And in many countries around the world, politics going into this pandemic was very divisive. And when you have a divisive framework at the outset and you add something as dramatic as a pandemic in the midst of that, it tends to amplify and exacerbate the divisiveness. I think we went into this, as I say, with very centrist politics, and as a result, a relatively cohesive society.
Yes.
And the pandemic, if anything, has amplified our cohesiveness.
Yes.
And so I actually think that puts us in a very small group of countries in the world that could actually say that. And I think that's really, as I look from a business person's perspective, and I think that's actually really encouraging and gives me a lot of hope.
Absolutely. I think that team of 5 million was just a fantastic concept.
Yeah.
It was about equity, it was about fairness, we're all in this together, which really appealed, and New Zealanders listened and they said, okay, that's what we need to do, and we'll look out for one another, which is quite interesting, isn't it? There's a book called Humankind, I'm not sure if you've read it, but Ashley Bloomfield has been encouraging people to read it, but that actually in a crisis, people work together and we're all out there to help one another. So I think there were some quite lovely attributes that came out as us, from us as a nation around our culture and how we really did at least check on our neighbour. We said, we all have to do this. So we all complied, which I guess being a small island nation was one of our sort of competitive advantages. Yeah. Whereas other parts of the world, for example, the US, was very much around independence and don't tell me what I'm going to do. So actually, no, sorry, I'm not going to comply with these crazy restrictions. So that's been exciting.
A political statement, right? Whether I wear a mask or not defines whether I'm Democratic or Republican.
I know,
basically, which is nuts.
Fascinating, fascinating.
Yes, I'm encouraged by that, and I think the interesting quantitative measure of how valuable that is to us will be the vaccine, the success with the vaccine. You see in Israel, which was the leading country in the world, they're now plateauing at about 60%. They're really struggling to get many more than that vaccinated. I'm absolutely hopeful that that sense of community and that sense of cohesion will motivate people here in New Zealand, despite the anxieties, to think, I'm going to get this vaccine, because that's not only how I keep myself healthy, but that's actually how I keep my neighbours, my elderly grandparents, etc., healthy. And I've seen that sense of commitment to do the right thing for the community all the way through this, and fingers crossed that flows through to getting a really high vaccine penetration, and that will have a tremendous benefit to business and the country as well, I believe.
I think the other thing too is there's an increased focus on actually acting with intent, and I think around travel it's much more purposeful as opposed to perhaps before, where people were almost flippant
Yeah.
about getting on a plane and going somewhere, whereas now there's a lot more attention to the detail of why am I going on this trip and what's the need for that. We've noticed that a bit in sort of interviewing as well. A lot of boards have said, historically we need to meet people in person, which is obviously the best optimum, but actually being able to communicate over technology and use technology in a different way. As I said to a board the other day, that's actually something we want in our leaders now, because they are going to have to use technology more effectively. So if they can't present themselves well on Zoom, maybe that's an issue.
I agree wholeheartedly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I spend my life on Zoom
yeah.
now, and we all have to be able to operate effectively in that environment. So
that technology as an enabler, I think, has become much stronger, which is great. And I also see a view that there are problems, but there's also a solution, and we can get through this. And I guess what you're saying, using technology, thinking about another way of doing it, we can still get our goods to market, we can come up with new innovative products, we can work collaboratively with the rest of the world. And I think it's, I'm really excited about the future of New Zealand.
If there's a challenge out there that I keep reinforcing to government right at the moment, it's about how we get foreign investment into the country. There's a huge amount of interest from both investors that actually potentially want to come and base themselves here. There's businesses that want to relocate to New Zealand because they see the way the leadership that's navigated us through this phase of the pandemic, and they see that creates a very positive environment for them to do business in. And people obviously that want to invest in New Zealand companies, and the hard border closure has made a lot of that more cumbersome. That interest may not be there forever. So I think the next phase, we absolutely need to be focused on saying how can we leverage not just our own resources to fund our recovery, but look to those from outside New Zealand that want to support our recovery as well. And as I say, there's a long queue, so we should be taking advantage of that.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. It's been fantastic to have a chat to you today. Really appreciate your comments, and it's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. I wish you and the firm every success for what lies ahead as well.
Thanks very much.
Cool.